All right, let me get some slides up here to share with you. I also am going to provide the link for these slides over in the Zoom chat. Um, I've got a few of these where we'll be doing some interaction. So yes, please do go ahead and open the slides. You are welcome at any time to scroll forward if I'm spending too long on something you find boring. You're welcome to linger behind if you're not ready to move on from one piece of information. I've got links you can open throughout the slide deck. So we do not expect everybody to pay attention in the same way or for the same amount of time. So hi, let me tell you a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today. Like Meg mentioned, I am in the process of developing a STEM education tabletop role-playing game called Adventures with Emmy. It is very much a work in progress, so I've got a big under development disclaimer here. I can probably skip my intro slide because that was very detailed. Thank you, Meg. And then I'll ask you what your experience is with games in education. And then I'll share with you some of the background reading I've been doing to get ready for this project. And then I want to spend just a few minutes at the end pitching this project to you because I am looking for collaborators, contributors, playtesters, reviewers on this project. So we've already had an introduction to me. I have these two wonderful children in my photos here that I'm looking forward to playing this game with whenever it is finalized and they are old enough. I am a Pathfinder Infinite Master, which means I have written so much third-party content for the Pathfinder tabletop role-playing game that I'm actually an official partner with the publisher. And we try to they ask me to they give me advanced copies of their materials so that I can time my releases to coincide with theirs. I'm actually working on an adventure that's going to come out about a month from today when their new book War of Immortals comes out. Another fun fact about me, I have professional clown training. So if we're ever in person, I need to make sure I bring my balloon animals. Okay, let's start with a little bit of discussion. So feel free on the slide deck to grab any of these blue background slides, grab any of these cards, and just tell me about your experience with games in education. You might use one of these prompts to start generating some ideas of what you'd like to tell us about. You might delete the prompt and just say what you want to say anyway. Feel free to take more than one card if you've got more than one thing to say. And if you don't mind, please leave your name at the end so we can ask you for some additional information. Is that better or worse? Same, same? Okay. All right, we'll get the microphone a little bit closer there. Okay, so in prep, thank you all for that input. That's wonderful. I have taken down some notes in the slides. So thank you all for that wonderful input. That's super, super interesting. So in preparation for this project, I've been trying to learn about, what's the current thoughts, states, practices of integrating games into education. And of course, we want to think about games in formal education and games in informal education. In terms of formal education, so how this might work out in a classroom, there's actually two ways to think about this. There's educational games, which sounds like a lot of what most of us have been talking about. And then there's this formal process of gamification. And so gamification uses game elements and aesthetics to basically enhance the student's experience of the course. So if students like playing games, if they're rewarded by things like storytelling, badges, points, leaderboards, things like that, then maybe we can integrate those features into our classes to make them game-like. It's kind of interesting. You see this a lot, but the studies in gamifications tend to lack a formal conceptual framework because it's kind of at the stage of, well, let's try it and see what works. And so part of what is missing in the literature is, well, if you did want to study this, like what would be the framework you would use? How would you go about trying to understand this? Oops, sorry. I thought that would open in another window. There we go. Trying to get links together. There we go. So studies in gamification tend to produce mixed results. Sometimes they improve student motivation, but sometimes not so much. One of the main concerns that I've seen in the literature is that you can end up, yes, motivating the students, but it's very extrinsically driven. It rarely increases their motivation to learn the material itself, or to be, intrinsically interested in the conceptual content. But there are a few examples here. If these sound of interest to you, feel free to go chase down those references. Like I mentioned, feel free to turn your attention throughout this presentation as you like. But we've got an example of a competitively gamified lab, an example of a circuit lab gamified with a means of class currency. So maybe you're purchasing benefits with that later. And then examples of gamified online quizzes. This seems to be really popular in either online courses or courses with a heavy online component, because then it's easier to, kind of use those gaming aesthetics and track those mechanics. On the other hand, educational games are where you're not changing the structure of your course, you're introducing some external media to a course in order to support learning as the students are pursuing the game's goal. So we've seen some examples already in the chat, but things like the Science Playground has a great collection. I ordered a few copies of Sector Vector a few years ago. I don't know if that's still in publication or not, but that was a really great example. And there's been a couple of quantum mechanics board games that have come out in the last few years that look really fun. We've apparently got a Feynman diagram card game, so I'll probably be picking up a copy of that this weekend. But even things like sandboxes, we talked about FET sims earlier. Even things like that, like sandboxes or a FET sim, can be used to create a game, right? It's basically providing you the pieces and the mechanics. And we as educators could use that to create, outcomes for the students. And so thinking about the two differences, you can kind of think it like gamification is changing your class structure, whereas an educational game is an element you might introduce in the class alongside your traditional elements like labs and homeworks. Okay, but we're here to talk about informal education today. So what about games in informal education? We already heard an example of that earlier with some wonderful, exciting Minecraft stuff going on. And so in terms of bringing in digital games, the novelty tends to be a pretty good motivating factor. So yeah, the Minecraft community, super excited about mods. And so introducing to them a physics mod or a quantum mechanics mod, that's bringing in some novelty along with the educational components. Games, of course, promote fun, playfulness, and engagement, although there seems to be a caveat that can be subjective, right? And so it kind of depends on the audience. So if I were doing the quantum mechanical Minecraft, I would probably want to make sure that my audience had some experience with Minecraft or some kind of experience with open-ended creative games like that. It looks like a lot of these efforts tend to promote interest more so than conceptual learning, and that's okay, right? We need to get people in the room to begin with, and so developing that interest is certainly just as important as promoting the conceptual understanding. There's an example in this link of multiplayer collaborative storytelling, which is essentially my definition of a tabletop role-playing game. We got an example of an augmented reality game focused on underrepresented groups. So augmented reality is things like a game that uses your phone's camera and can show you like little pop-ups over things. So maybe I have a scanner on my phone or something that's showing me like velocity trails or temperature diagrams or something like that. And then at the bottom here, there's a review article outlining a lot of the learning outcomes that can come out of using games in informal education. So again, hope these resources are helpful to you. So that's what I've been reading lately to prepare for this project to develop my own STEM education tabletop role-playing games. It sounds like we're pretty familiar in the Zoom call with TTRPGs, but if you've never played one of these before, if you've seen Stranger Things, if you've ever caught a stream of Critical Role, they are usually playing Dungeons and Dragons there. That's kind of the most popular example people give. I do want to acknowledge that the publisher behind D&D has been making some not so great decisions lately and throwing the hobby into a little bit of chaos. But D&D is certainly the most familiar example that folks are familiar with. The basic idea of a TTRPG is that players collaboratively tell a story using dice rolls to adjudicate outcomes. So this is not a competition. You're not playing against your other players. You're not even playing against the game master who's controlling the monsters. You're all working together toward a goal of telling a cool story. Usually, not every game is like this, but usually you have one player taking the role of a game master and everyone else controlling a player character. So the game master controls the world, sets up the challenges, they're in charge of the quote-unquote monsters, but they also might represent an ally who's come to help you along your quest. When a GM is running one of these games, they might run a published adventure or they might develop their own story, but usually they do a little bit of both. When I run a game as a GM, I like to run it where my players don't know where the printed adventure ends and my ideas begin, and they usually spend a lot of time wondering where the new content is. And kind of like what I believe it was Rose discussed earlier about designing player characters, is you're choosing feats and statistics to represent your character in the game world. So the classic example of this is whether you play a barbarian, a wizard, or a rogue to determine like what you're really good at, what you're not so good at, and how you tend to interact with the world. TTRPG publishers will release player options, options for the GM, information about the setting that you're playing in, as well as adventures. And here's an interesting part that's going to be important later, is that usually there's a thriving market for third-party authors to publish their own materials. And we'll talk about more about that in a second. So my work in progress that I want to pitch to you today and that I'm looking for some assistance with is called Adventures with Emmy. The goal of this game is to highlight concepts from STEM fields in a fun, strategic, collaborative storytelling experience that develops and reinforces the player's knowledge. So super important here, we want the players to use their STEM knowledge at the table, kind of like what Rose mentioned earlier. We want there to be a bit of alignment between what the player is interested in and how they identify and what the character is interested in and how they identify. The premise is that Emmy Noether is conducting a series of quests and wants your player characters to go on these quests to learn stuff about science, to maybe go find a missing scientist, to help a scientist make an important discovery. It pretty much plays like the TTRPGs you might be familiar with. There's dice rolls, there's statistics. The element that I'm adding that's really making this an educational game is something called the resolution rubric. And I have a link to a sample here. We'll also look at a sample on the next page. The idea about the resolution rubric is to take care of that scenario where the player says, can I do this really creative plan? So the classic example is as I'm playing a wizard, I want to cast a lightning bolt spell, and my enemy is standing in water. And I claim that if I cast the lightning bolt spell at this creature, they should take extra damage because they're standing in water. And the GM scrambles and looks around and says, well, there's not a rule for that, so I don't know how to do that, right? And the conversation kind of stops there. The idea of the resolution rubric is that if the player presents a sufficiently detailed argument, meaning they make a claim, they give evidence for that claim, and they present their reasoning for that claim, it gives an outline for how the game master can reward that creative thinking. Let me show you an example. Here's one that I've developed for a water elemental. So imagine you're playing with your player characters and you suddenly come across this enormous towering watery figure that's threatening to push you all over. And you also have been told that there is a heat lamp somewhere else in the room. And you get the bright idea, I could probably make the water elemental evaporate. Well, we would want to hear a nice thought out description of why that would work. So what we would do as the GM is we would listen to that player's argument for why this should work, and we would be looking for these three elements to their argument. If they successfully make all three, so they're establishing that if you get the water elemental closer, it will get hotter, that heat makes water evaporate, and therefore we should be able to get it closer to the heat lamp. You can declare that an automatic win for the party, right? We would call that argument fully proficient. And you say, okay, we're no longer requiring rolls. We're going into narrative mode. tell me how you do this. And it's an automatic success. Everyone celebrates. You give them a little bit of additional information, and we move on without having to go through rolling and taking damage and all that stuff. If they mention 2 out of the 3 elements, we call that proficient, and everybody at the table gets some kind of bonus. It's not a guaranteed win, but we're going to stack the deck in your favor. If they only mention 1 of these, if they say, can't we do something with the heat lamp? We want to reward that, but we also want to hold out for maybe they'll say something more. And so there we give a nice little bonus to, to the player who's made that that element of the argument, and hope that they'll develop as play continues. So the way you would play this on the player side, we talked about building a character earlier, and you choose, the biggest choice you make is what kind of character you are, whether you're a magic user or a warrior or a sneak or something. Well, instead of all of that, your player character would specialize in a field. So instead of being a fighter, wizard, rogue, you'd be a biologist, a physicist, an electrical engineer. And when we talk about the options you're choosing, you're going to choose actions that have either the hypothesis trait or the design trait. What does that mean? Well, a hypothesis action requires you to state an explanation or a prediction about what's currently going on in the game. The game master compares your hypothesis with the resolution rubric and evaluates the outcome and says, well, that sounds like that works. Your hypothesis is correct. That's on the right track. Let's call that partially correct. Or no, that hypothesis is incorrect. Here is the key, is that even if you have a wrong hypothesis, you get some sort of positive outcome. It's just a different positive outcome. So none of those outcomes, correct, partially correct, or incorrect, is a failure. It's just a different benefit. Let me show you an example on this next page. So I've assembled a team of TTRPG writers who have STEM backgrounds, and I'm asking them to write stuff aligned with their backgrounds, because I as a physicist should not be telling the biologists how their character should play. But I have written a couple of options for the physicists so far. So the way you know this is for the physicist is it has the physicist trait. It also has the combat, concentrate, and social traits, which just gives an idea of what's required to do this. I could use this in a combat scenario. I could use this in a social scenario. And what physicists love to do, of course, is create models. And so I choose a creature or object to start compiling observations about, and I start making a mental model about this creature. And basically, at the beginning of each of my turns, I get to ask a free yes or no question about the target of my model, and that helps me refine my model. Well, once I have that, I might want to build a small representation. I might want to build a little stick figure. I might want to draw a diagram that represents it so that I can make a test. This is where I'm going to state my hypothesis. So I construct a simple physical representation of the model's target. State a hypothesis to your GM about the target's resolution rubric. I think this is what's going on, and I think this is what's going to happen if I do this. Your GM tells you if the hypothesis is correct, mistaken, or partially correct. If you're correct or partially correct, you get a bonus to 1 check. A check just means you're rolling a die and adding your modifier to it. You're adding your stat to it. And here you're saying it can be 2 higher or 1 higher, depending on what it is you're doing, right? On the other hand, if it's incorrect, you actually get a +1 bonus to something called your difficulty class. This is where somebody is making a check against you. This is boosting your defense against the water elemental that's trying to knock you over. It's a benefit either way, but it's a different benefit based on whether my hypothesis was correct or incorrect. And so what I would love to see as an outcome of this would be for players to intentionally make incorrect hypotheses because they want the defensive bonus there. I would love to see that come out in gameplay sometime. We also are working on design actions. This is more for the engineering side, where instead of stating a hypothesis, you're stating a solution. So you're saying, I see that the problem is this. I want to try out this solution. So as a mechanical engineer, you're going to try to give your fellow players an extra action. So at the beginning of each turn, you get 3 actions or 3 deltas that you can do. You can spend them on anything. If you've played D&D, they categorize these into standard actions, move actions, and bonus actions. In Adventures with Emmy, an action's just an action. It's just you get to do 3 things on your turn. And so this is saying I want to boost my allies' efficiency to get them an extra action, and here's how I'm going to do that. And so you get special outcomes based on, whether your design was appropriate to the situation or whether it was a glorious failure. So I am planning to put together, meaning I have one page drafted so far, an NSF proposal through the Advancing Informal Science Learning RFP to fund the development of this game. And of course, NSF wants research to go along with this. So things I'm thinking of on the research side is how we can frame an educational TTRPG as an informal learning experience. Some great advice that I've received so far from folks is, trying to get this in the hands of high school teachers and college faculty is a great idea, but you'll probably get more responsiveness and a greater impact if you reach directly out to folks who work with informal science learning, because this would need to take place outside of class anyway. And so what we want to do is connect the material distribution with research participation. So what I'd love to do with this grant is pay for the development of the game and the printing and distribution of printed game materials to get it in people's hands. PDFs are wonderful, but there's something about having that rule book in your hand with art and layout that just kind of energizes the game. And so we're going to look for things like, how does this help support knowledge and scientific argumentation? How does it help develop STEM identity? Again, going back to Rose's point about, to what degree do you identify with your character? That's a good question. Like, if students go and play this game, how many of them build a character that's got the same academic interest of them, and how many of them use it as an opportunity to explore a different academic interest they've never considered before? Big research question would be, what elements of game design and adventure design can support knowledge development, argumentation, and collaboration? So let me get to my last formal slide here, and then I see we've got some things in the chat to respond to already. In terms of where I'm at in this process, like I mentioned, I have a team of writers with experience in the TTRPG industry who also have STEM backgrounds, and we have a pretty good diversity of academic backgrounds there. Would certainly love to hear from folks who are interested in contributing to that. My personal philosophy on collaboration is that I want to choose a project that I'm going to do no matter what, and then invite others to join in ways that they feel are appropriate for them. So in terms of spots I'm looking to fill, I have one co-PI on this project. NSF will allow me to have 3 more if this is something that folks would love to participate in on that research side. We've also got spaces for senior personnel and the advisory board. We would love to garner some experience with outreach, informal learning, or game-based learning. Preferably folks with gaming interest, but not necessary, although it looks like we certainly have that on the Zoom call. And most importantly, we need a lot of folks to help with the play testing, because we can write a great game and run it, but it really doesn't work if I can't hand it off to somebody else to run and have it make sense to them. So you've got the link to the slides in front of you. I've got some further details on another couple slides on which tracks I'm looking at under AISL. But otherwise, I want to say thanks everybody for your time and participation, and hopefully we've got some time for further discussion.